Parent with purpose, disciple with direction, and leave an intentional legacy. This is The Informed Parent, a Think Media podcast. Today's going to be a little bit different. You're going to hear the story of a mom who walked through incredible circumstances with her 13-year-old daughter. The thing that I think stands out about this story is this is a mom who's much like most of us as parents. She probably would have said, this would never happen in my family, and yet it did. January Littlejohn is joining me. Her 13-year-old daughter was socially transitioned under her nose at her school. She woke up to this information having no idea what was going on. The thing that makes this story so interesting is January Littlejohn was a mental health counselor. She's very informed, knows what's going on, and yet was caught completely off guard. You're going to be so intrigued to hear her journey, her path, and what she's doing in the state of Florida right now. She speaks nationally and is passionate about helping others understand gender ideology. You're going to really be informed today, so lean in. You might even want to take notes. Welcome, January. Thank you so much for being on today.
Thank you so much for having me, Suzanne. I'm really looking forward to our conversation.
I am too, for a couple of different reasons. One is you're just a wealth of information. You've been through quite a journey with your family, and you have a background, but you also have the experience as a mom. And I think the other reason I'm excited to invite you on is because I feel like you've sort of entered into this as a mom, probably thinking, like a lot of us would, this would never happen to my family. We're engaged, we're involved. And so you have quite the story to tell. You have so much information I want to dig into. But before we do, I would love for you to let's just start with introducing yourself and telling a little bit of your story. And then we'll kind of get into the things that you've learned and what you're sharing, if you don't mind.
Sure. So I'm a stay-at-home mom in Tallahassee, Florida. I have 3 amazing children. And prior to COVID, I was just a normal soccer mom. I was a volunteer at my children's school, but I also did a little bit of substitute teaching. So I was very involved in their schooling. I had a very good working relationships with their teachers. And I really enjoyed my time in the classroom and just volunteering and getting to be around kids because I actually have a background in counseling. And prior to leaving my profession, I still maintained my license, but that was a part of my life that I missed. And so this was kind of a way for me to continue to be around adolescents and just learn about what the kids are experiencing these days and seeing different trends and things of that nature. Because my specialty was adolescents with ADHD.
So you have the background professionally. You're a mom, you're engaged, you're involved. And you, in your family, you start to sort of walk through a journey that you were aware of. Will you tell us a little bit about what was going on in your family at the time that sort of all this unfolded?
Sure. So at the height of COVID, our daughter was 13 at the time, and she came to us out of the blue and told us she no longer felt like a girl. And this was shortly after 3 of her friends at our local middle school in her friend group had also suddenly started identifying as trans. And so I want your audience to understand that when we think of the word transgender, it no longer just means someone identifying as the opposite sex who is experiencing distress over their sex. Today, children are being taught that they choose their gender and that they can choose to be a boy, girl, neither or both. And of course, today in 2025, we know a lot more about what's being taught, what this ideology is, and what is happening as a result. But you have to remember, this was at the height of COVID back in 2020. Very little was known about this, and parents were just starting to get a glimpse of what was being taught in the school system when everything shut down and went online. So when our daughter came to us, we took this very seriously. But one of the first things that I noticed was what she was describing and telling us, and certainly the fact that this came out of the blue did not align with how I was trained clinically. And in the late 90s, this issue was so rare. Words like non-binary, gender fluidity were non-existent. This was not being taught because it didn't exist. And so I was just really thrown off during that time. I saw my child struggling with other issues at the same time as a result of the schools closing down. Online schooling was disastrous for her because she does have diagnosed ADHD, even though she's also gifted. So that was just a really tough time for adolescents in general. She thrives on structure and routine. And so when that all was pretty much pulled out from under her, she was experiencing stress just as she should. So we did elicit the help of a mental health counselor at the time. And thankfully, this counselor was not on board with immediately affirming the trans identification, which I didn't even know my profession had gone that direction.
Okay.
So as school started, so this was May when she told us.
Like,
It
can I ask you
escalated.
a question
Sure.
just to clarify real quick? So when you were noticing other things that were affecting her mental health, just the isolation or the change, that piece, and then this significant piece of information comes out. I think it's really important for the listeners to hear that the fact that you're listening to this through a mom's ear and through a professional ear, and neither one of them are making sense to you. So when you went to get help, when you sought help for her, were you seeking help specifically around this gender piece, this ideology, or was it mental health as a whole because you were seeing this a little more broad? You didn't know how far this had gone.
That's a good question. It was really around the other issues because what had happened is when I reached out to the school in the fall. So during the height of COVID, that's the other thing that was very challenging, if parents can recall. You couldn't find counselors. They
Mhm.
were all booked up. No one was seeing anyone in person. So it was
That's
all
true.
online. We're so quick to forget how chaotic that time period really, truly was. So it was very challenging even to find someone that had space on their client list. The first therapist that I called, I immediately intuitively knew that she was not ever going to see my child because she said that her approach is to let the child lead. And so I quickly realized that, first of all, when do we ever do that? That doesn't make any sense. So you're going to affirm my daughter in this faulty thinking that she's not a girl? Well, that doesn't seem healthy. So again, like I really hadn't done the deep dive until I reached out to the school as I had done so many times before because honestly, I saw the school as a partner into educating my child. I no longer see their role as a partner, by the way. And so what I was told was that, well, let me back up. So I emailed a teacher and I let her know that we were handling this as a family. And I was essentially just letting her know because I thought it was going to come up. My daughter was wanting to go by a different name and use they, them pronouns. So I wrongly assumed that because I told the teacher that we had gotten help for our daughter, that we were getting help, that we were not affirming at home, that was going to be the end of it. Well, because we're still in litigation, there are aspects to that email conversation that I can't divulge. But 2 weeks, about 2 weeks after that email
Mhm.
communication, my daughter got into the car and said, Mom, I had a meeting at school today, and they asked me which restroom I preferred to use. So I was immediately confused, number one, as to how and why they had a meeting with my child and didn't notify me about it. But then also, why were they asking her which restroom she wanted to use? She is obviously female. That is a huge safety issue. So I emailed the guidance counselor and I was called back with the guidance counselor and the assistant principal that day and told that they could not give me any information about the meeting they had with my daughter, who was 13, by the way, because she was now protected by a non discrimination law. My only recourse was to then go to the assistant superintendent and speak to her about it, which
I
I
think,
did.
and I also want to just share, I want to remind everybody this is in Florida that arguably has some of the most protective laws in place, I think. And you might tell me different later on, but
Yes,
this is
we
not,
do now.
this is not people are thinking California or Oregon. I mean, I just know where our minds go. This is in Florida. This is unfolding. And I just,
Right.
again, going back, it's before everyone was talking about this. So I'm trying to imagine as a mom having no context that this is happening anywhere really in the world and getting a phone call saying, hey, this is happening. And or my daughter telling me this is happening and the school saying, and you don't get to be a part of this. At that point, it seems a little bit, it's been normalized a little bit at this point because we've heard so much, but I just, the shock, you must have been so confused.
I was in shock, but I was so angry and I was concerned about the damage that had been done because it took about 6 weeks for us to finally get an in-person meeting with the principal of the middle school. And that's where we were shown the transition. Well, it's called a support plan, but of course that's a horrible name for it. But it's really a social transition plan that they were putting these kids on, oftentimes without the parents even knowing. And this plan was not just about name and pronouns. They asked the child which restroom and locker room they prefer to use, which sex they prefer to room with on overnight field trips. And then they put the burden on the child as to whether or not the parents are even going to be notified, because they asked the child, do you want us to call you by your birth name and birth pronouns with your parents or use your preferred name? And that's to essentially deceive parents that these social transitions have even taken place. And so it was from that point on that I did a deep dive into this, because by this time, my daughter had spiraled. She was talking about wanting puberty blockers, things that I had never heard of, talking about wanting to go on testosterone, and talking about cutting her breasts off. So this, to me, it just seemed outrageous. Number one, that the school interfered in the way that they did, but number two, that they affirmed this lie. And I even, I said to the principal during the meeting, my daughter wants to cut her breast off. And you guys are okay with that? Like, it felt like I was in the twilight zone, because you have to remember, this was a time period where the Parent Bill of Rights had not been passed. The Parental Rights in Education law, which we have now, that was partially based on what happened to my family, had not been passed. And so, you hear Florida and you think of all these protections that we have now. It's because of these horrible violations that we went public with eventually.
It's astounding. And the fact that you are able to listen to this out from both perspectives and thinking about it, like, obviously as a mom, your mama bear is up and out and roaring during this. But when we first met, just this idea of do no harm, at what point did it sort of click in from mama bear to, wait a minute, what the counseling piece and the profession? It was that simultaneously, or did you sort of like kind of come to the realization, wait, the experts, the counselors are feeding this, not just going along with it, but perpetuating it?
Yeah. So when I did a deep dive, because number one, I wanted to know, why are these girls suddenly believing they were born in the wrong body? What is it they are being exposed to? But then I also started looking at my own profession. And by October I think that's around the time that I found Abigail Schreier's book, Irreversible Damage, the transgender craze that is seducing our daughters. And that really solidified for me everything that I thought was going on intuitively with the social contagion aspect of this. Because what I was telling my husband and my daughter both is that it is statistically impossible for you to not only have one trans identified child in your friend group, but 5. And it just kept happening. Someone would identify as non-binary, then gender fluid. And these were changing. That's the other thing that I noticed, is that my daughter's identity changed 4 times in 2 years. And so when I started to look at, well, what does the School Counselor Association say about this? What does the Medical Association say about this? What does the American Psychological Association? And they all said to affirm. And I finally found some information, because when you Google this back then as a parent, all that would come up is affirm your child in any identity he or she chooses, use the name, use the pronouns, or they're going to commit
That's
suicide.
right. Over
It
and over
is
and over
the
again.
most egregious lie that has been used to blackmail and manipulate parents into believing that lying to their child, affirming the delusion, is a compassionate thing to do. So, the other thing that I realized in my profession is that no differential diagnosis was happening. That is our job as a clinician when you're doing a thorough assessment, is to ensure that these symptoms are not being caused by something else. And by this time, I had found, it was called the PIC Resilience Project. I don't even think it exists anymore, but it was one of the first organizations that had detransition stories. And so, of course, then I'm researching detransitioners and what does desisting mean. And that's really where I understood that these individuals were vulnerable, just like my daughter was, and they were failed by people in my profession because the whole movement had gone to an affirmation only model around 2015, 2016. And
That
so what that
early.
means is you don't explore any underlying issues. And what I was seeing has happened with a lot of these detransitioners is what's called diagnostic overshadowing. So as soon as the client says, I'm trans, all of the attention goes to that identity and ensuring that person can transition medically. And they're being sold the lie that once you do that, all of these root causal issues that are accompanying the trans identification will disappear.
Well, this whole season we're talking about identity, and clearly this conversation, it's very easy to figure out where mistaken identity comes in and what's going on. But I do want to, you raised your children in faith, correct? I mean, you're
Yes, I mean, this radically changed our life, Suzanne. So I'm
okay.
not going to pretend that my walk with Christ was anywhere near where it is now. And I
Mhm.
believe the Lord has used this crisis because, you brought up identity. What these kids are experiencing is an identity crisis. And I spent so much time, we went to church and we professed that we were Christians, but really walking with Christ, what that looks like for me now is very different
Mm.
than what our lives were like before this happened to our family. And it really took me almost losing my daughter for the Lord to just completely pull the wool from my eyes. And I saw things very clearly. When you really start to walk with Christ and do the work and read the word, things don't land the same for you anymore. Even movies that you used to think were okay and appropriate. So, my husband and I both, it brought us closer to the Lord, and we started parenting in a very different way. And we also repented. We
Mm.
repented not just to the Lord, but to our children. It was a learning experience, and for them and for us to come to them and say, we used to think this was okay. It is not. And so we really started to transition to really raising them with a biblical worldview. Like many other parents in this situation, we did end up having to pull our daughter from public school, and then we ended up pulling our other children as well. Because in order for us to truly protect other families from this happening, we filed the first federal lawsuit against the school district for parental rights violations because we didn't want this to ever happen to any other family.
That's phenomenal, and I commend you for even being able to go back and even repent or to see. But I think like most of us who have a crisis or something really traumatic in our life, it propels us in a direction towards truth. And I think it's so fascinating that you were, as a mom, this is nonsense. As a professional, this is dangerous.
That's
But then
right.
even waking up as a Christian saying, wait a minute, there's a worldview here. And the word of God tells our children who they are. We don't
That's
we
right.
don't get to sort of pick out like a kindergartner picking out their identity and putting it on as a label, but it's sure and never changing. And so for our children to kind of walk in a culture where if they're not grounded, knowing this is already established in Christ and through Christ, He tells us who we are. It's so easy to get swept away, and especially in middle school when they're craving belonging.
That's right.
You feel isolated. They're craving belonging. Their friends are doing it. This is just the next new thing to do. It's so easy for kids to fall into this. So I appreciate the fact that this, as you and your husband are waking up, because we're all learning. Who in the world would have even thought that this was a conversation that we had to have? So that's such a great example of just excellent parenting. Parents, you don't have to navigate today's cultural chaos alone. At Beacon Parent, we're igniting a movement of awakened parents who live out God's truth, lead with purpose, and leave a lasting legacy. It's time to step into God's design for your family. Our mission? To train, equip, and resource generational-minded parents and grandparents, helping you parent with purpose, disciple with direction, and build an intentional legacy of faith through gatherings, community, and the local church. Join us as we offer practical strategies and biblical insights, providing the tools and resources that you need to navigate today's culture with confidence. Because living out God's design for your family starts at home. Are you ready to lead your family and disciple with direction? Visit beaconparent.com or follow us on Instagram at Beacon Parent and discover how you can train, equip, and inspire your family to live light with intention. Beacon Parent, light your path, lead your family. We talked a little bit when we first met about what I think we both would describe as a parenting crisis, just that we're seeing. And I would love to know from your perspective, having walked through this and been with other parents that are going through this, what do you think that crisis is, and where, in your opinion and words, where does that come from?
Well, we have lost or forgotten what our authoritative role should be in our child's life. And, the Bible's very clear that children are a gift from God. And even Proverbs 22:6 says, train up a child in the way he should go, and when he is old, he will not depart from it. It is our job to teach our children. We are the ultimate educator in their lives. And we have abdicated our role in so many ways and outsourced what we should be doing as parents to doctors, to therapists, to teachers. When you drop your child at that school, if that teacher thinks that they are the ultimate authority in that child's life when it comes to that child's education, you've already lost the battle, because as the parent, you are. And the teacher should understand that their role is to partner with the parent in educating their child, not the other way around. So I even had that backwards initially. And so it took me a little bit to fully understand and grasp that. But I tell parents now that if your authority is being undermined in any institution, whether it's the doctor's office or the school or even the church, it is your job to pull your child from that situation and make sure you're only placing your child in a situation where you are the ultimate decision maker for that child.
Absolutely. I couldn't agree with you more. And I think even having those conversations with a lot of parents and talking about what we're seeing happening in this type of a situation, but really in any circumstance, I'm telling parents more and more, even with your little ones, if anyone tells you not to trust your parents or that your parents aren't trustworthy,
that's right.
That person is not trustworthy. Run, don't walk to me. Like having the conversation with other parents, having the conversation with your spouse to make sure you're on the same page. Like, no, we're leading in this, but also having that conversation with your children. That's a heads up if someone tells you not to tell your parents, you can't tell your parents. Do you want to tell your parents? That is a heads up for your child to run, not walk to you.
Well, and that's such a great point, because the other issue that I'm seeing in this parenting crisis is parents not wanting to set appropriate boundaries for their children. They want to do this, gentle parenting was really popular when I was learning to be a therapist and starting to have my children. And so, one of the things that really opened my eyes to how damaging and dangerous that is was Abigail Schreier's second book, Bad Therapy. And it really made me understand, especially when I'm now talking to parents all the time. That's what I do pro bono for, my free time, is I help parents whose children have fallen prey to gender ideology. And it's really, really important for that parent to be able to sit in conflict with their child. If they are not willing to sit in conflict with their child and be the quote unquote bad guy for a little bit, and your child may even really hate you for a little bit, it's our job to set appropriate boundaries to keep our children safe. Nobody else's. That's our job. And if parents aren't willing to do that, no amount of laws that we get for parent rights is going to help them. Their children are going to be vulnerable, not just to gender ideology, but all kinds of
That's
secular
right.
critical theories. And so it's really important. Dr. Leonard Sachs has an amazing book called The Collapse of Parenting. And he talks about how important it is for you to be the authoritative role in your child's life. Now, that doesn't mean that you're not loving and compassionate either, but your child has to understand that you are in charge, because they crave boundaries, they crave authority. That is how parents show love. It shows them that they matter and that you care what happens to them. So it's really, really important for parents to understand what their role is in their family. They cannot be their child's friend, maybe later in life, but children are extremely impressionable. And if they are not getting that authoritative role from you, they're going to get it from someone else.
It's so interesting that parents ask me all the time. And I have a Bible study that I lead that has 20s, 30s, 40s, 50s, 60s, 70s, and one 84-year-old woman who comes as a mom. It's a mom's Bible study. It's totally fascinating. But the question of gentle parenting comes up over and over and over from the mamas that are 20 and 30 and the parents that are younger. And, what do you think? And I don't have a background in counseling, so I've really had to dig into what does that even mean and how is that even defined? And it's defined in a lot of different ways, depending on who you look, where you
Right.
look and all the things. But the one thing that I think is so critical that you're saying is God has entrusted us to lead our children. When you started this interview with saying, all of this affirming is follow your child. And I think about, Paul saying to the disciples, like, follow me as I follow Christ. Like that I'm supposed to be following Christ and my children are supposed to be following Christ. It's not to turn around and follow my 8-year-old. And so does that mean, be harsh? Or the fruit of the Spirit is gentleness. So
Right.
it's not a type of parenting. It is a fruit of the Spirit that I bring into parenting when I am setting boundaries. That, like, it's a difference between being controlling and having authority, God-given authority, and answering to the Lord. So I love how just the affirmation to parents that lead your children. That is how they find security. That is how
That's
you
right.
build trust.
Yeah. And I even tell parents, that have children entrenched in this ideology, no one's going to rescue your child. And that's really hard for them to hear, because oftentimes they want to outsource this issue to an expert. And I have to remind them, you are the expert of that child. A therapist is not going to fix your child. A therapist cannot fix your child. They can maybe help your child work on co-occurring issues. But, I'm very careful with even recommending parents take their children to counseling these days, because it's so dangerous. Counseling is not a neutral act. It's not without risk. That's what Abigail's whole book is
Mm,
about, bad therapy.
wow.
But parents also have to understand that they are the expert of their child. That counselor is going to see that child 1 hour every week or 2 weeks maximum. You're with your child 24/7, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. You know your child inside and out. And so that's sometimes tough for parents to hear, because this issue, it really just turns your life upside down.
Mhm.
It's to me, it's akin to watching uh, my daughter struggle with anorexia. There was a lot of parallels with the self-loathing, but then at the same time, our society doesn't affirm anorexia. They're not
That's
celebrating
right.
anorexia. So that's what was so disorienting to me was not only was my parental authority violated and undermined every step of the way, but this self-loathing, this form of self-loathing and self-hate was being celebrated by those around me. And that was just sick. There's really no other word for it. To celebrate a young girl wanting to cut her healthy breast off, that's evil.
It is evil. You said something again when we first got to know each other that I'm not really familiar a whole lot with a lot of counseling, and it just struck me. You said, "Listen, if someone goes into counseling or is seeing a counselor and there's not an exit plan, like there's not a place you haven't identified. This is where we're trying to go, and when we get there, you're launched." Then that is a major heads up. And I had honestly never given that any thought whatsoever. Will you share a little bit about that? Because I do think therapy is so common right now. The classroom is therapeutic education to some degree.
Mhm.
And so we have so many people that are looking for therapy, not saying that there's not a place for counseling at all. But
100%.
if we don't understand like what is healthy counseling and a healthy approach to counseling, I think that would be helpful for parents to understand, because I perked up when you said that. I thought, gosh, I need to really, that's a good thing to filter.
Yes. And I think this whole notion that counseling is for everyone, even children, is a very dangerous belief system, truthfully. Because when I was trained back in the late 90s, that is what we were told. Everybody should go to counseling. Everybody. Like there's no harm. And what Abigail Schreier's book talked about is iatrogenic harm. And it's when the treatment itself can cause harm when it's meant to heal. And I can promise you that therapists are not being trained in this. And that is not just a disservice to the therapist being trained, but it's a disservice to all of us. Because the other thing that's happened, there's so many factors that have made this entire situation a recipe for disaster. Of course, phones and social media play a huge part in it. But what you have to understand is the push for mental health in the schools, the use of therapeutic language, even in gentle parenting, it's all been so normalized now. And so what we have are situations where normal adolescent feelings have been pathologized. So kids, one of the things that the Lord has called me to do after all of this happened to my family is I'm a youth leader at our church. I run a small group twice a week for middle school girls because I fully believe the only way to really win this war that's been waged on our parent-child relationships and our kids is to fully inoculate these kids. But what I'm learning and seeing more and more is, number one, that all of these kids are having identity crisis.
Mm-hmm.
And if they're not finding their identity in Jesus, they're of course finding it in other harmful things, including mental health diagnoses. And so what I mean by that is, so kids will come to youth group, or I'll hear some of my daughter's friends talking, and they don't say, "Oh, I feel sad about that." They say, "I feel depressed." Normal stress is now, "I have anxiety." A shy child is being told, "Oh, you have social phobia." So they've really pathologized all these normal adolescent experiences. And then what do parents need to do when they hear these words? "Oh, I need to take my child to therapy." Now, just like you said, Suzanne, I want to be very clear that there is a place for therapy. If your child is suffering from anorexia or something serious, of course that child needs help. But if the child is experiencing normal adolescent feelings, or even what is perceived to be, teasing in middle school is a really tough time.
It is. And it always has been.
Yes. And that's where we as parents have to step in. Our kid doesn't need to go to counseling because they got made fun of, in PE. That's not helpful. And in fact, what we're finding and what research shows is ruminating on these negative feelings causes them to expand. So for instance, I saw therapy as short term. It needed to be short term, and you needed to have identifiable goals. What we are seeing now is therapy dependence,
Mm.
We are not creating more resilience in these kids. And I have strong concerns about the amount of money that we are dumping into the school system under the guise of mental health and how that's actually going to backfire because you see these kids, there's an overemphasis, an overfocus on mental health. So, Abigail gives a great example in the book about if you're in the locker room at halftime of a really important football game, the coach is going to, tell you what to do and tell you to focus and focus on what the goals are, focus on your job. He's not going to say, how do you feel about that?
Yeah, that's
These
true.
over focus on feelings, which is also part of that gentle parenting, is really, really bad for kids. It's not teaching them how to be more resilient, how sometimes you have to put your feelings aside. We can't be led by our feelings. It destroys productivity. And so now we are seeing situations where kids are actually getting out of important milestones in school that would make them stronger. We're not teaching them to overcome their issues. We're teaching them that they can't continue if they have issues. And then we're giving them 504 accommodation plans to get them out of whatever makes them uncomfortable.
Yeah,
We are not helping these kids.
and you just said it, like that they're not learning to be overcomers. And yet, when you look at identity through a biblical worldview and through the Bible, they're the I am statements. They're not the I feel statements. They're the I am statements. And one of the identities that we walk in as believers is I am an overcomer. I've been told I'm an overcomer in Christ. And so, how do you, as a believer or someone who's raising their kids in the Word, with God, in church, understanding your identity in Christ, if you're walking in that, and then not allow your child to experience the fact that they are an overcomer? I always say to parents, I said to a friend last week, if comfort is sort of your God and you don't ever want to risk anything, you don't want to have to push through anything, and you've made comfort an idol, that gets really difficult because one of Jesus's names is the Comforter. And if we were
Right.
never going to be uncomfortable, we would never get to know the Comforter. And so learning kind of who we are and then the things that we have to do because of who we are, and separating the identity out from the feelings and the behaviors. It's so critical to be able to separate identity out from behavior and feelings. So I have a couple of other questions I want to ask as we kind of wind down. And one of them has to do with, you mentioned in your sort of research and in your story in walking that there is a type of child, that there's a sort of I don't know if you would call it a prototype, but there's a target almost that you're seeing, or it's sort of been identified, a child who looks like this sort of has a target on their back in terms of this ideology. Will you explain that just a little bit for parents that are listening?
Yes, absolutely. And it's so strange because as I speak to parents, and I've spoken to hundreds of parents by now, all of our kids are eerily similar.
Hmm.
And so many of them are very artistic, quirky kids that march to their own beat. They're not into kind of mainstream activities, interests. Many of them are either ADHD or on the spectrum. Many are gifted. Many, like my daughter, tend to hyper focus on subjects for long periods of time before she can transition. And so it may be something like, a kid will hyper focus on a book series for a really long time. And that's all he or she can talk about, which is very off putting to maybe people that aren't interested or as interested into that. And so it's these kids that don't have great social skills, kids that are already vulnerable, looking for a place to belong. A lot of these girls do have co-occurring mental health issues. Some of them have histories of trauma. Porn, unfortunately, plays a role in this when kids, especially girls, are exposed to porn at young ages. They falsely believe that that's what an adult woman is expected to do. And so then they don't want any part of what, becoming a woman is. And so that's really the kind of child that is particular vulnerable. The kids that are into theater. It's really the artistic kids that's driving a lot of this. And when I did my deep dive, anime is huge in
Interesting.
this. And so, my daughter used to frequent websites like DeviantArt. And so even the more innocent ones that are meant for children called Scratch, if you go into the Scratch website, they're asking pronouns. There's whole, groups of children creating LGBTQ art. And one thing that we didn't get into is how seductive these identities are for these lost children that are seeking a place to belong. Because each of these quote unquote gender identities, which by the way is a completely made up concept, none of us have a gender identity. Sex is binary. There are two. That is the end. The rest is a child's personality. But they've sold the lie that we all have these gender identities that only we know. It's an internal sense of our gender. It's a feeling. Here we go with the feelings again. And many of them have their own colors, their own flags. So it's very enticing to these kids because it gives them this makeshift identity. And then they also get all of this love bombing and encouragement from teachers that are, also
Right.
indoctrinated into this false belief system, like the GSA clubs at school. It used to stand for Gay Straight Alliance. It's now Gender Sexuality Alliance. And so parents have to understand that there's been such a steady erosion on our parental authority and our parent-child relationship, which is why we're also unfortunately seeing a lot of these adult children estranged from their
Right.
parents. And
Absolutely.
that is and not even just in this area. That's just become very common for adults to believe that their parents may have been toxic or didn't support them in some capacity and that it's okay to go no contact. That is such an evil attack on the parent child relationship. It's parental alienation on steroids.
I'm hearing that over and over and over again. I had a friend who last week who said she was going to babysit for her granddaughter and had blocked the time and all the thing. And she was just in a common conversation, average conversation with her daughter. She said something to her daughter, just like, have you thought about? And it offended her daughter. And she said, you know what? That really bothers me. You don't get to babysit today. Like just using emotions and children. It's rampant. It is rampant. Well, I could talk to you. I have 4,000 other questions I want to ask. I do want to close with one thought. So we know that there's some change coming. We've heard, DEI is going and the Department of Education and legislation. And we're hearing things that are, I believe, positive in the area that we're talking about that could affect some positive change. And I think it's very tempting to think, whew, thank goodness it's over. I'm super concerned that we have a window right now to press in, that there's so many kids and families that have sort of been hijacked with this ideology, that this is not time to take our foot off the gas. And I'd love to know, do you agree? What are you seeing? And as we wrap up, just any anything that's just your last thing that you want to say to parents as we kind of conclude our time together.
Yeah, absolutely. Laws are great, but it does not change the hearts and minds of people. And there are so many people that really, truly don't understand how dangerous this ideology is, what these medical interventions entail, that we're actually sterilizing these vulnerable children. And, children cannot consent to these irreversible interventions like a double mastectomy and going on puberty blockers and testosterone. Yet it's all based on the child's self ID. So, we know that the vast majority of Americans believe that this should not be done to children. But we as Christians have to understand it's a lie even for adults.
Mhm.
And we don't affirm people that we love in delusions or lies. Because even with adults making these types of decisions, They can't give informed consent when they're not truly being informed. And when they're being sold the lie that, number one, that these modifications to their appearance, their physical appearance, is somehow going to magically turn them into the opposite sex or a non-sex. So I just really encourage Christians, especially, we've got to be helping to change the culture. And until that's done, yes, we need laws. Those are very important. We need lawsuits. We need parents standing up when their rights have been violated. But I believe that the only way to truly win this war is to fully inoculate, especially young children. And that's why I co authored the Church Transgender Response Guide for churches, pastors, and parents, because we have to teach our children biblical truth that they were made in God's image, male or female, and they need to hear that message early on and consistently. And they also, just like you had said, Suzanne, they need to hear the clear message that if anyone, even a teacher, tells you it's okay to keep secrets from me and dad, you need to tell us immediately that person is no longer safe. And so they need to have, the language down to know what to say in those situations.
Mm-hmm.
And parents need to understand that we've got to keep having conversations, have them with your pediatrician. Make sure that your authority is going to be honored and respected, because a lot of parents don't even know what their rights are. And I'll just give you one example. Just recently, they tried to give my daughter a mental health assessment at the pediatrician's office. This was part of her physical. But then when I went back for an ear infection, they were trying to give her that same garbage assessment, which they do on an iPad. Parents often don't even know what their children are looking at. And they're given, now I understand, from the American Academy of Pediatrics, they are being told to give a depression screening to children 11 and up at every appointment. That's
seeds.
the kind of overemphasis of mental health that is actually going to backfire and hurt children. So parents need to opt out of these things. You do not have to allow these types of things. Tell your pediatrician, your doctor, do not talk to my child about gender or sexual orientation. That is my job as a parent. You need to be clear about the expectations, and we need to be helping to change the culture, not sitting in the back seat thinking that everything's going to be okay because we have laws. And I can tell you right now, there are many states where these secret social transitions, just like what happened to my family, is still happening. Parents Defending Education just found that there are still over 20,000 school districts in our country that are doing these social transitions without parent consent. So the work is far from done. And parents have to understand the dangers of this. And we really need to get pastors and churches, especially youth pastors, engaged and helping to protect and safeguard these young minds and hearts from this insidious ideology.
So will you tell us how is your daughter doing now?
Well, thank you for that question. I am really protective over her privacy, understandably. My husband and I took a huge risk when we went public with our story, and then ended up filing the federal lawsuit, because at the time our daughter was still very, very entrenched. But we took the hard steps that parents need to take. We took her cell phone, which was a huge mistake, even giving her a cell phone in 8th grade. But we took her phone for over 2 years. We changed her school environment. And honestly, Suzanne, we leaned into our relationship with her. It took a great deal of time and effort to repair the broken trust that the school helped facilitate. And so we were fortunate that the Lord had completely healed our daughter from any confusion. She's on fire for Jesus. She's actually a senior in high school now, and really just experiencing normal adolescence. And that is such an important point. This ideology robs these children of normal experiences they should be having, normal maturation, normal growth, because the focus of their identity is all self. They become hyper focused on themselves and really obsessed about passing as whatever sex they're trying to pass at. And so, one thing that I tell parents, is that in addition to leaning into the relationship and cutting the trans influencers, get your child involved in community service. We actually ended up taking our child to Nicaragua on a mission trip. And one of the things that really came out of that is I asked her, I said, what is something that changed for you after that trip? And she said, I realized what true suffering was. So many of these
Wow.
kids think that they've had trauma and all of these words that are being thrown around, but they have no baseline to compare anything to. And so getting kids involved in community service, whether it's through the church or through your community, is just really important in general because so many of our kids are just very, very self-focused, and they need to understand that there are people that are really in need out there. And
What
it's
a
really
great
our
point.
job to meet those needs. But thank you so much for asking. I don't talk, a lot about her experience through all this because that's her story to tell if she ever
Right.
wants to tell it. But I also don't blame these kids that walk away from these identities and never want to look back. This
Yeah.
has really
Yeah.
been really, really hard on her. Being an adolescent girl is hard enough, but then to have this kind of personal story in newspapers and things like that can't be easy either. But
Yeah.
so
But
many
what a great
parents,
report.
yes, so many parents
It's
are
a
having
great report.
success walking their children on the other side of this issue. Many of them don't choose to go public, and that is okay. They just want to continue to protect their family and their children's privacy. But it's also important for the people that do feel comfortable telling their story,
Yeah.
giving other parents hope. And so we
Hope.
have a website now called Parents of Desisters. It's a project out of PIT, which is a Substack. It stands for, I think it stands for Parents with Inconvenient Truths About Trans or something of that nature. But it's all parent led and it's all parent stories. So it's very, very cathartic for these parents to often write anonymously about the experience and the trauma that they're having with their children.
Awesome. Well, I'm glad she's doing so well. That's amazing.
Thank you. I really appreciate it.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's why I can fight as hard as I'm fighting. Not only does she support what I'm doing, but she wants to help protect other kids from falling prey to this destructive ideology.
Well, January, thank you so much. You are a powerhouse, and thank you for sharing your story and for allowing God to use your story to help so many other people. You're on the front line. Appreciate you so much. Appreciate the clarity that you have and that you bring to other people. We'll make sure in the show notes that we put the guide in and the other references that you mentioned. But thank you so much for your time today and all the work that you're doing.
Absolutely, Suzanne. And I just want to give parents hope. If you are one of the parents like me who had a child or has a child experiencing this kind of distress and confusion, you can parent your child through this.
Mm.
It took 2.5 years. It was not easy, but you can get your child on the other side of this confusion. A lot of parents are having success walking their children through this confusion. So feel free to reach out to me. There's a website called Parents of Desisters now. So there's so many more resources available to parents than were, 4 years ago, certainly. One of my favorite Christian resources, I just want to plug in there real quick. It's actually Catholic. I'm not Catholic, but I still love it. It's called the Person and Identity Project. It has some of the most clear, biblically sound information on identity that is out there.
Awesome. Well, we will pass all of it on. And I so appreciate you. Thank you again.
Thank you for all you're doing. Thank you.
Okay, parents, I know that one was informative, but it's also a little bit heavy and it's a little bit overwhelming. There was so much information. But when you think about the fact that we were listening to someone share her experience, both as a mom and as a professional, it's just fascinating to be able to step back and say, not only am I upset that you have hijacked my daughter, but then to know that the information that you are that she's hearing about her daughter is harmful. The first time I spoke with January, the thing that jumped out to me is she said, listen, this is my profession and we commit to do no harm. And yet children are being harmed through a profession, thinking their parents are dropping them off thinking, hey, this is going to be the answer. So I love the fact that she's calling us all to attention as parents. Whether or not your child has struggled or suffered in this specific area, we have to engage and take our rightful position as their parents and as the authority in their life to guide and protect. And so I think that she really calls all of us up and out. I think the other thing that was just so fascinating in listening to her is, and I pointed it out at the beginning, but we are so accustomed now to hearing about this topic of kids being transitioned and detransitioned and that whole process. It's 2025. This happened to her in 2020. And yet when we listen back, the fact that a parent would be shocked that this was happening, shocked to get a phone call, no idea what was going on, didn't know what binary, what are you talking about? And she's a professional. And now all of us know that language. This has been so normalized. And if we as parents all know this language, what is going on in the minds and the hearts and really just the thinking and the processing for our children? So this is, again, a call to attention, a call to get engaged, to really learn. Legislation has been put in place in Florida, and we all kind of point to Florida going, look, they've got great, strong legislations, but it's because of people like January Littlejohn who really, really dug in, learned. She was informed, she got the information, and then she went to work. And so I pray that if you're going through this, that this was a resource for you, that you feel encouraged. And if you're not going through this specific thing, that you're just encouraged as a parent, that we have what it takes. We know our children, God has entrusted them to us, and we can get them over the other side of any of the hurdles that they're going through. We just have to lean on the Lord. So I hope this episode really helps you parent with purpose, disciple with direction, and leave an intentional legacy. Parents, with all the chaotic thinking in our current culture, it's hard to know who or what to trust. But it shouldn't be this way. We're not meant to live with a spirit of fear. The Think Media platform is loaded with content that you can trust. Content from a biblical worldview. Content like the Informed Parent podcast that will help you develop your cultural discernment as a parent and create conversations with your kids that lead to wisdom. Wisdom is our goal. It's easy to access this content. Just go to thinkmedia.com and create a free Thought Leader account. Simply enter your email and password to get access to hundreds and hundreds of talks from experts in all channels of culture. Plus, get access to the Think Framework, Guide to Better Conversations, and the Create a Conversation digital tool. Remember, informed parents make informed decisions. Sign up for your free Thought Leader account at thinkmedia.com today.